is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's really fun to be with you guys, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, but I'm glad to be here for a bit. JD gave me a lot of freedom, I guess, to sort of define exactly what to talk, the scope of this and what to talk about. And so essentially what I want to do is to reflect on sort of the evidence on cash transfers and what we've learned about them over the last 20 years or so, but then also use that sort of as a prism to think a little bit more broadly about how decision-making works in global development and who has decision-making power, and hence the title Power Paradigms. And so I sort of want to essentially share with you a bunch of things that have been influential in my own thinking, but build to a fairly simple point, which is that I want you to think about cash transfers not just as a sort of impactful tool within the existing paradigm, but as a sort of different paradigm or part of a different paradigm, in the sense that a lot of decision-making power gets transferred to people who have very little of it, and that there's a sort of deeper sense in which that's different and important to contemplate. Yeah? Okay, great. So I'm going to sort of organize things around these sort of three paradigms that I think are on kind of blocking the screen, JD.
Yeah.
I should move this over a little bit. Yeah, great, thanks. If you were to crudely categorize the way decisions get made, three paradigms that might help to map out that landscape a little bit. Starting with, I think the thing that we've all been working to try to move beyond to some degree, which is primarily narrative-driven decision-making. So decision-making that's based primarily on qualitative experiences we've had in the past, which are informative, but not necessarily as informative as we'd like them to be. So a couple of examples, just pick on the Tom's Shoes guys. I'm really sorry if you are from Tom's. These are good guys, right? They wanted to make the world better. But this is an example, I think, of sort of decision-making that is narrative-driven, in the sense that the founder of Tom's went out, he saw a real need, like a real issue in the world, that there were kids without shoes, and decided to do something about that, and built this company sort of based on the buy one, give one model, and really brought that model to prominence, right? Although they weren't the first to do that. This became a big thing, and it's pretty well known, and there are a lot of business school cases written on this. And it wasn't until much later that people really started digging into this question of what are actually the impacts of pumping a lot of shoes into these communities? What are the impacts on the kids who get them? Also, what are the impacts on the economy, manufacturers of shoes, and so forth? And so, long story short, it sort of doesn't seem like a very sensible thing, in fact, to sort of ship in a bunch of shoes into these communities for a whole host of reasons. And so eventually they've actually moved away from that, right? And so now if you buy Tom's shoes, some of the profit that generates is going to be given to causes that benefit communities, but it's not going to be generating more shoes, which I think is a good thing. Another example that was super salient for me early in my career was microcredit. So 2005, I was just finishing up my first year in graduate school. I had been part of a microcredit intervention program in undergrad, in college. And there was just enormous energy and excitement around this, right, at that time. So 2005 was the UN year of microcredit. In 2006, Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, right, for their work. And a big driver of the excitement behind this was that the story was really powerful, right? And especially for me, as sort of an academic who is at risk of ivory tower syndrome, right? This idea that Yunus was sitting in his office and felt like the papers he was writing, the analysis, weren't really making a difference, and that he went out into the streets, met people, talked to them, and started lending his own money to them, and then saw what they were able to do with it. That was a really powerful narrative, right? And I think there's important lessons from it. That said, it was a full decade from this year, the year of microcredit, until the year that the first sort of high-quality experimental evaluations of microcredit came out. It was 2015 that the first collection of these were published, and that prompted a real reconsideration, right, and a real rethink. And that's ongoing. People are still debating the right way to interpret it, but I think generally speaking, felt like this was not as good as we had hoped to see, or we had led to believe, based on the narratives. So again, there's a lot of nuance in the interpretation of that, but I think this is also an example of sort of the power of narrative and the kinds of insights it can give us, but also the ways in which narrative alone can be misleading. Cool. So where I think a lot of us, and probably if you're here, you're maybe at least to some degree sympathetic to this view, is that we want to be moving from a purely narrative-driven approach to one that's more evidence-driven, in which funders and organizations are deciding what to do based on quantitative causal evidence of the impact that things they have previously done have had. And so I want to talk a little bit about what decision-making in that paradigm looks like, and give you a few examples, and dwell for a bit on cash transfers, which is the part that I personally have been closely involved in, but then also reinterpret that a little bit. One example which I like is deworming, which, as I don't know, you heard from Gibwell yesterday, right? So this is sort of one of the causes that they have really championed as being high impact based on the evidence. Here's Evidence Action's Deworm the World initiative, some numbers on this. A lot of this was driven by a series of studies, especially studies in Kenya, that seem to show really high impacts on kids' educational outcomes, and then also when people have been tracked over the long term on their employment outcomes and their labor market earnings much later in life, right? So really remarkable long-term tracking, rigorous evidence. There's also been a huge amount of debate about this, the interpretation of this, and how confident we should be in it. So if you're familiar, you may not know this term, there's an episode called the Worm Wars, in which there was just enormous amount of debate about whether we had interpreted the evidence correctly or whether being too over-optimistic about it, and whether deworming for young kids. These I should have said, by the way, so the issue here is that kids often pick up these intestinal worms, right, helminths, and so this has like very deleterious health effects. It causes diarrhea, it impacts their school attendance, their learning, all these other things, right? And so it's very, very cheap to treat, and so it seems to have really big impacts. But there's been a lot of debate about it. But the thing that I think is great about this is it's debate in the context of evidence and about how to interpret that evidence, and it's debate where we can put some numbers on things and say, what would you have to believe for this to be a worthwhile investment, right, the use of funds. So point being that having high quality evidence of causal impacts does not necessarily always lead to clear dispositive answers that everybody agrees on, but it does to some extent define the terms of debate and lets us have informed debate, which I think is a good thing. The other example I wanted to share, which isn't cash transfers, is also an example of something that Evidence Action, the same NGO, has done. And so I wanted to pick two things that they've done for a reason. Partly it's just because Evidence Action is a cool organization and they do a lot of things that are evidence-based, which is great. But I also wanted to sort of draw out an organizational point as well. So this is another thing that they did for a bit called No Lean Season. Have you heard of No Lean Season before? Yeah, some of you? And so the idea here was that there are people who sometimes need to migrate seasonally, like from the countryside to a city, in order to work and provide for their families during the lean season, right? That's the time when there isn't much employment opportunity in the countryside, and that's typically a hard time, right, for families. That's the time when kids go hungry, these kinds of things. And there are some barriers to that sort of migration, right? To some extent, it's just, it's not fun, right? It's not nice to be away from your family for a long time, so it's definitely a second best solution to the problem. But there are also basic financial frictions and hurdles, like it costs money and there's some risk involved in sort of going, you don't know if you're going to find a job in the city and so forth. And so the idea was to make it easier by offering this transportation subsidy, which you can see was quite cheap, to sort of say, basically, we'll buy you a bus ticket, right? So that if you want to migrate during the lean season to try to find work and send money back, that's easier to do. So there was a first evaluation of this at a modest scale, which looked really promising, right? Like we're spending very little money on a bus ticket, and the impact on people's earnings and on the livelihoods and the nutrition of their families was really big. Right? And so based on that, No Lean Season said, we're going to take this on and scale it up, right? Because that's the way they work. Right? They say we take things that seem promising that aren't being done, and we scale them up and attract funding for it. But to their credit, as they scaled it up, they also continued to evaluate it. So they did a second larger scale impact evaluation, and that actually found essentially no impact on average. And it turns out that in part this was an operational issue. So as they scaled up, what was happening is that the program officers were more and more targeting these subsidies to people that would have migrated anyway, is what they think was going on. So there's this little detail, right, that it actually matters whether you're finding people that are marginal or inframarginal, like makes a big difference, and your ability to maintain the sort of integrity of the targeting at larger scales becomes essential. And so, if you're an operational person, that won't surprise you, right, that those things really matter. But the bottom line was it just didn't look like this thing was offering any sort of bang for the buck in line with what had been expected. And so based on that second study, the evidence, they decided to shut this program down, right? And so they don't accept funding for it anymore. And that's very uncommon, right? You don't often hear of someone making a very public decision to shut something down because they've decided it's not having the impacts that they would like it to have. So I think that's great, and they should be celebrated for that. The other reason I wanted to show you that they do more than one thing is I think that's much easier to do if you do more than one thing. So they had people that were working on this program that were then able to go and do something else within Evidence Action. Right? That's a lot easier than shutting down your organization, telling everybody, I'm sorry, to all the people who have taken a bet on the mission, right, and kind of committed their careers to working with you. So I think this episode is also helpful for thinking through some of the ramifications of making evidence-based decisions, right, and some of the hard choices you might have to make, and about ways to structure organizations that make it easier to do the right thing if you do get some bad news. So another example of what evidence-based decision-making could look like. Okay, so on to cash transfers, the bit that I've done. So I'll tell you a bit about the story and the journey. GiveDirectly, we got started when I was in grad school doing my PhD. And we actually started on a day when I was introduced by my advisor to a guy who was not a researcher, but an entrepreneur. And he was working on sort of mobile payments in the Indian countryside. And so his version of mobile was actually not mobile phone-based, which is what I'm showing you here, but he would put like a mobile ATM on the back of a motorcycle and send that guy out to rural areas and to transact, and then come back and sync up at the end of the branch bank at the end of the day. So anyway, we were talking about this model. I was interested in it because I was starting some work on anti-corruption in India. Like maybe this is a way to secure payments, would be a good thing. But at some point, what really struck me about it was that this guy's work and the work of other people, like mobile money deployments, are creating this world in which effectively everybody has a bank account or could have an account, right, that we could put money into. And that seemed to me like a fundamentally very different world, like an interesting world to think about. How would we do development in a world like that? And that's only increased since then, right? So today's numbers are just sort of massive amounts. And I can tell you more about this, but GiveDirectly, we've made a very intentional effort to go out and run projects in places where we thought they would not work, and pretty consistently been able to get money to anybody, anywhere in the world. The costs vary, right? But I think it's feasible anywhere. So we should think about this as being a world like that. So the big obstacle we faced initially was that there was just a lot of skepticism about this idea. Definitely I had grown up hearing, sort of in development circles, that it's not a good idea to just give money to people living in extreme poverty. And so, this is the first time the New York Times covered what we were doing. Gives you kind of a feel of the sort of tone of the conversation in those days, right? Actually, people working in the development space were probably a little bit ahead of this in the sense that people were seeing like the evidence coming out of Progressa in Mexico, which was one of the first big cash transfer evaluations. So, but certainly among sort of like the US layperson, the typical donor philanthropist, there was like, this is like flying directly in the face of everything they had been told, right? This is like exactly what we've been told not to do, and we're saying like, let's do it. And so we had to confront that. What has worked and been powerful over time for us is that there's just been an enormous amount of evidence on cash transfers, right? And this very simple idea of giving money to people and letting them decide what to do with it, and then sort of learning through experimental trials about what they do with it and what kinds of impacts that has. And so the way I try to summarize all of this is, first that there's like an important sense in which it is not summarizable, right? Because the whole point is to let different people do different things. And so there should not be one answer to like what are the impacts, and in some ways that's a very good thing, and so I'm happy about that. But some abstractions that I think are true are that generally speaking you find a lot of positive impacts, including impacts on kids, that we don't see the things that people were most worried about, that you don't sort of see big impacts on people's consumption of alcohol or tobacco or their tendency to gamble or domestic violence or these sorts of things. And in fact some of these you see reductions, so like the sort of review of evidence on consumption of alcohol, tobacco generally says people seem to consume a bit less or spend a bit less on those things when they receive transfers, not more. So generally speaking, very good. One of the things that's been cool at GiveDirectly over the years as we've scaled is that we've been able to run experiments at a much larger scale. So all the outcomes that I described to you on the previous slide were sort of like what happens to an individual or to a family when that family gets money. We'd also like to know what happens to an economy or to a society, right, when a lot of people in that community are getting cash transfers, right? There's a big influx of purchasing power, right, of capital. And historically, we haven't been able to answer questions like that, either for cash transfers or for other interventions that we're interested in. Like you could also ask like what happens to a community when like everybody gets a cow or everybody gets deworming or any of these things, right? Those aggregate effects may sometimes be different in important ways from the individual level effects. And so this is a lot of sort of math and graphical stuff that you don't need to understand, but I'll just sort of explain the key things. This is from a study that we recently finished in Kenya, where it was experimental, but the randomization was not at the household level, but at the community level, right? So which villages received transfers and which villages did not. And then we did a lot of work to map and to measure what was happening in the economy around those villages. So what households were doing, but also what was happening at local firms, their profits, their revenue, how many people they're employing, also local government, sort of what governments are doing, how much tax revenue they're collecting, what projects they're spending, things like that. And so what that lets you do is if you add it all up, you can estimate what economists call the fiscal multiplier. Right? This is like how much does the size of the economy expand for every dollar that was spent on it. And so this is an important parameter for a lot of policy making in rich countries like in the US. If we think about in a recession, like how we're going to spend money, what kind of multiplier effect can we expect if the government expands fiscal polity or provides transfers to people. The first time it's ever been done experimentally to my knowledge, and it's also quite unusual to get estimates of this for low-income countries. And so here in this particular setting, the estimates we get are quite big, right, in the range of 2.5 to 2.3. There are two different ways we can do this using entirely different data. You can do an income-based measure or an expenditure-based measure. If the accounts are sort of done correctly, those things should add up and they should give you the same answer, and they do give us roughly the same answer. So this seems to be a setting in which actually like demand is a big constraint on development, right? In the paper we talk a bit about why you see this kind of big multiplier effect. We think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are a bunch of little firms that could serve more customers if there were more customers to serve. In in essence, right? You have a bunch of firms that have like one employee and they maybe see 2 or 3 customers a day. Think like small scale retail or a little post-show mill that grinds grain or things like this. So there's a lot of interesting economics underneath this. But the point, I think the key point I want you to take away is that we're now able to do these large scale experiments that tell us some aggregate lessons and speak to bigger questions about the process of development, as well as just the household level effects. One thing that was super important for us, and this sort of relates to our being here today, is that we were growing up alongside a bunch of other changes in the ecosystem, right? That it was becoming a more evidence-friendly and evidence-driven ecosystem. And so I really want to emphasize that because I think for many people sitting within whatever organization you're a part of, you say, well, we've got to think about the role that evidence plays and where we can contribute at the margin. But those changes, in isolation aren't going to change the system. And doing them together, making changes together in concert, so that both aid implementing organizations and funders and evaluators are all shifting, I think has been super important. Certainly for us, because what we were doing was so unorthodox and seemed so dubious to much of our audience, right? So GiveWell, who you heard from yesterday, coming into being around that time, Good Ventures, Life You Can Save, all of these organizations got started roughly at about the same time as we did. Google.org had been around for a bit longer, but under Jacqueline Fuller's leadership, when she came to the helm, I think they really shifted towards a very heavy evidence-based focus, and they tend to be very quantitative, as you can imagine, right? It's a sort of technical entity. We also really benefited from internal champions at some of our partner organizations in organizations that were not super evidence-friendly, right? So USAID spends an enormous amount of money on global development and does very little sort of rigorous impact evaluation of it. I don't think they have a great count, but Daniel Handel, who was the internal champion for this project, told me he estimated maybe 2 or 3 sort of impact evaluations per year across the global portfolio, right, during the period up until we started working together on these projects. This is a really ambitious and risky project for USAID to undertake. The essential idea here is to take some of their existing programming and give that to some people, and also give cost equivalent cash transfers to some other people and compare the impacts of those 2 things. Right? So they're really putting what they're doing to the test and saying, are we getting more bang for the buck on the outcomes that Congress has told us they want us to prioritize by doing what we do, as opposed to just giving the same amount of money to people and letting them decide what to do with it, right? And that is just risky for them in a whole bunch of ways. And so there's a ton of work to kind of, even just to build a legal framework, as I say here, to get them comfortable that they can do this and that it's not inconsistent with their congressional mandate. But also then just to be open to the possibility that the results might say no, like that actually these aren't the most effective ways to achieve those outcomes. So doing any sort of evaluation is very unusual. This kind of head-to-head evaluation of 2 different alternatives, like very unusual. And so I just have a ton of appreciation and respect for people like Daniel who are able to get this through. These are ongoing, so we have a bunch of these in different countries now with USAID. But the ones that have come in so far, I'd say the results have been that the cash transfer program generally does more for the outcomes that USAID cares about than the conventional program. There's lots of nuance within that, but I'd say that's like the right general takeaway. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's something that I haven't talked about that I want to. To transition to my last sort of idea, I want to share this quote, which I really like. This is from Jan Egeland. He's at NRC. He was formerly the head of OCHA, an important sort of leader in the humanitarian space. And humanitarian has been the sort of pillar of development programming that I think has been most cash-friendly, most receptive to it. Partly maybe because they're more evidence focused, but also I think especially because there's a strong sense in the humanitarian sector that sort of human dignity really matters and that treating people respectfully matters, and so I think there's just more intuitive acceptance of it. And so this was a few years back. Jan said something that I think is very telling, which was essentially that like the evidence is very convincing. As he says, the overall argument is won, but there are important debates that continue. And the numbers at this point, and even still now, right, despite the fact that I think there's pretty broad-based agreement in the humanitarian sector based on the evidence that they should be doing more cash transfers, it's been very slow to adjust, right, in terms of the share of humanitarian programming that goes as cash transfers. And sort of Jan has this remark, right, as he concludes that this challenges established ways of operating in the humanitarian sector. And so I really want to drill into that, right, because this is where I think you can start to see this notion of decision-making processes or paradigms, and how cash transfers are different in a more fundamental way from existing processes than they might be as an intervention from existing interventions. Yeah? So I think what Jan is referring to here specifically is that the way humanitarian aid is structured is around a series of silos or verticals. Right? There are organizations that focus on health, on nutrition, on housing, each of the above. Right? And so in the old paradigm of decision-making, right, where we would say, here's what we think people need and we're going to provide it to them, that made a lot of sense to have those kind of vertical specializations. The problem is that with cash transfers, cash transfers are not a health intervention or a nutrition intervention or a housing intervention or an education intervention. And so they don't fit, obviously, anywhere in this structure, right? And there's been a lot of grappling about that and some positioning in terms of which organizations want to be doing cash transfers and so want to position themselves as the player to do cash transfers. But there's a very deep sense in which, like, structurally, the way the entire sector works isn't built to accommodate cash transfers. In fact, there's some funny verbiage that has come out of this. Have you heard of the term multi-purpose cash transfer? You come across that term? So this is a term that evolved within the humanitarian sector to describe situations where you're giving people money and you don't care what in particular they do with it, as opposed to situations where you're giving people money in the hopes that it will have impacts on nutrition, right? Or on housing or on education, right? And so to me, it's a very funny thing, because to me, that that is the definition of a cash transfer, that it's multi-purpose, right? That's the whole point, right? It's flexible. So the idea that we would need to come up with new terminology to describe multi-purpose cash transfer, that kind of captures the sense in which this just doesn't fit, right, with the entire ethos of decision-making, right? The paradigm of decision-making within the organization. To go back to that example that I was just praising, here's a criticism of it. It's this bit right here, right, which is that the learning objectives, in other words, the outcomes that we're measuring, are tied to these programmatic mandates, right? So USAID is given money by Congress with these very specific earmarks, right? This is for nutrition in Rwanda. And so part of the reason they're interested in doing these evaluations is because they really can only justify spending money on cash transfers if they can show that they're an effective way to achieve that particular outcome, right? Of course, if we give money to poor households in Rwanda, they're going to spend some of it on food, but they're going to spend some of it on other things as well, right? It's not a nutrition intervention, right? But we're evaluating it as if it were, because that is the dominant decision-making paradigm, right? So it's evidence-based, but with this very particular flavor to it, right? Here's another example that's even more extreme. So this is from a fascinating series of studies that were done actually back in the late 80s and the early 90s by the US Department of Agriculture. And this is with respect to food stamps in the US. So I came across this when we were thinking about setting up some similar studies in India, giving people a choice between getting their existing food in-kind benefits and getting money instead. And that's like a widespread question, like when's the right time to give people food or money? And I found out that we'd done this in the US, that there were a series of these really high-quality trials that were conducted by the Department of Agriculture, which runs the food stamp program, where they took some people who had been getting food stamps and offered them the equivalent amount of money instead. And then they looked at the impacts that had on a bunch of outcomes. And so as I read the evidence here, it sort of seemed like people spent less money on food, and they spent more money on other things like clothing and housing and things like that. And I said, that's pretty much what I would have expected. That makes sense. That seems pretty good. People had more flexibility. But obviously, we didn't move in that direction, right? We still have the food stamp program. And so I thought maybe there's an interesting lesson to learn here about the political economy of these decisions and about how evidence gets used. And so I wanted to find out. And I spent a lot of time, because the people that were there had all retired, and I eventually tracked down somebody in retirement that was willing to talk to me about it. And what he said was, they never had any interest at all in shutting down the food stamp program or converting it into a cash transfer program, but they had this problem, which was that occasionally a congressman would call up and say, why do we have all this machinery, this bureaucracy, it's complicated, why don't we just streamline this thing and do cash transfers instead? And they said we had to be able to show that this thing was better for our constituents than the alternative. And the constituents they meant were the farmers, right? Because it's run by the Department of Agriculture, right? So they had to show that giving people food stamps leads to more food consumption than giving people cash, right? And that's exactly what the studies showed, right? So now they have this evidence that they can show to people when they get harassed by Congress and say, no, there's a reason we're doing it this way. It's better for American farmers, and that's our purpose, right? So the point is, this is evidence-based decision-making, right? Yeah? Right? But with a very specific objective, right? And within a very specific decision-making paradigm where the power is held by farmers. Just to give you some sense of how different things can be if we relinquish some of that power. This is one of the things that got me really piqued and interested in cash transfers when we were getting started. So after that conversation with the guy with the motorcycles, I started looking around to see if other NGOs were doing cash transfers and sort of what they were thinking about them. And specifically at that point, I was interested in whether anybody would let me give. Would you open that up so that I could send money directly to somebody living in extreme poverty? And Oxfam had been one of the organizations doing more of these projects. And so I came across this blog post by Duncan Green, who's a wonderful guy. And Duncan was sort of reflecting on this cash transfer project they did in Vietnam, where apparently a lot of people spent the money on coffins. They felt like it was very important to be buried in a coffin and not to be thrown into a hole and have dirt thrown over you. And so Duncan had this really thoughtful, philosophical reflection on how do we feel about that? as development professionals, right? That's not the sort of outcome that we typically measure. Like share of people who are buried in a coffin is really important to people in this community. Are we okay with that? Is that development? Do we support that? Or do we want to prevent that? Spend money on other things? If that's the priority of people in this community. I thought that was very thought-provoking. Right? That kind of informed the way we thought about the role of evidence at Give Directly. Another example from Give Directly's experience, a lot of the studies that we did in the early days, we started out in areas in Western Kenya where, as you can see here, like the two main roofing materials are either thatch or sheet metal. And so, better off people if they can afford it, like to have a metal roof. And not surprisingly, one of the main impacts we saw in some of the first studies we were doing was that a lot of people were upgrading, replacing thatch with a metal roof. And we hadn't really been expecting that. I mean, we didn't have any particular expectations, I guess, but that hadn't been on our radar. So we went and talked to people afterwards to try to understand more about this. And it turns out it seems like it's a really sensible investment in the sense that, first, if you have a thatch roof, to keep it in good shape, you have to either replace it or repair it, and that costs a fair bit of money. And so there is some, sort of avoided maintenance cost that you get by installing the metal roof, and the ROI on that in a financial sense looks pretty good. There are some other interesting things about it. You can use it to collect rainwater, which is like a relatively clean source of water, so people like that as opposed to like traveling, to the river or to the lake to gather water, which is more likely to get you sick. There's also a sort of a psychological bit of sort of not having a roof that leaks on you and sort of the security of sleeping at night and hearing the sound of the rain, which, who knows how we would value that or put $1 on that. But, this to me was really, I felt like, boy, there's a lot that I did not understand about these communities and about what life is like in a hut that has a thatch roof versus a metal roof that I would, not have appreciated going in and that I learned from the study. So I share that as an example of sort of a use of evidence where the point was not so much to figure out whether we hit some pre-specified goal that we had determined, but rather as a way to learn more about the communities we're working with and discover more about what they see as priorities and what they see as opportunities. Yeah? Cool. So I'll kind of sum up then with that, which is the sort of two main ideas that I wanted to convey through some of these stories and examples. Are that you can think of cash transfers as being another tool within an evidence-based paradigm. You can ask, like, is this a cost-effective way of achieving goals that we've set? But you could also think of them as being a sort of part of a fundamentally different paradigm, which is about transfer of decision-making power from the people who currently exercise most of it to people living in extreme poverty. And it's not the only way of doing it. So there could be things that look more communal, right? There are models where we say, let's give a grant to a community and set up some structure within which they can decide on some public good investments, things like that, right? But all of these things look very different from the way the bulk of foreign aid and philanthropic decision-making works today, right? And so I think that if you think of cash transfers merely as another tool for achieving the same goals, you're sort of missing a lot of the point. And then the second point is that if you do think of cash transfers that way, evidence still has a role to play within that paradigm, right? But it's a different role. It's no longer as much about are we achieving things that we have set out to achieve, and more as a way of learning about other people and what they see as priorities or as opportunities, which I think can be very valuable. So, at Give Directly, we've generally said, we do want to test to make sure that we're not causing serious harm, right? That we want to look for some of these, there were these concerns going in, right? What if people are abusing transfers in ways that are hurtful to themselves or to others? And so we want to check and see whether there's like widespread evidence of that. That's something that might cause us to change our decision making. But if we don't see that, then we tend to see the evidence we generate more in this light, right? As a learning opportunity and a way to provoke thought and reflection and discussion among donors, than as saying, sort of here's what success looks like, and we're going to tell you how much success we can achieve per dollar that you give us. To close then, tie this back a little bit to Scripture and to this the faith that we have in common here today. I see this as related to a couple of passages and concepts in the Bible as I've reflected on it. I very much like this one from Philippians. I'm sure it's familiar. Many of you have seen this. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Paul's writing here sort of in a ministry context about the ways the people in the church in Philippi were approaching ministry. And if I think about my work, my vocation or ministry, and the people that I work with, the community or the sector, I don't think that selfish ambition feels like the right term, right? I think there's a lot of very generous and very giving and selfless ambition, if you would, in the sector, right? A lot of people get into this for exactly the right reasons, because they care. But the sort of in humility valuing others above yourselves part doesn't quite ring true to me. I don't think that a lot of programming is structured in a way that's reflective of that, right? That values other people above ourselves. And so I feel like there's perhaps something here for us to think about, to reflect The other thing I think a lot about is this notion of being created in God's image, that all of us are, and that we all bear the image of God. And that a big part of that is becoming sort of miniature creators, right? That in the same sense that God is creative, we can in our small ways be creative and be creators of structure and order and beauty in the world. And that enabling that in other people is potentially a very beautiful and powerful and I think scripturally aligned thing. Right? And so when we have the opportunity to empower others in a real sense, right? So empowerment's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and so I think it's often effectively meaningless, but I mean empowerment in a very real sense. Like I have less power and somebody else has more, like a transfer of power. I think that can also be creating opportunities for people to exercise that creative facility, right, that they've been endowed with, which I find really beautiful. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you, guys.
I think we have some time for questions, if anyone has any questions. And yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you sharing this. Something that I've heard before when bringing up like the impact of give directly and cash transfers is the multidimensional view of poverty as both material but also spiritual as well, social, personal, kind of like this holistic view of poverty. So I'm sure you've encountered that as well with people saying maybe like, well, yeah, this alleviates material poverty, but what about spiritual poverty? Like our program is addressing like spiritual poverty that people have,
Right.
And therefore we do it this way. Like, what would you say to that kind of framework of thinking?
Yeah, I think those spiritual poverty, I find that the phrasing a little odd. That's maybe a longer conversation about whether that's the best word to use for it. But certainly there's like both material and spiritual dimensions to life. There's like history in the church of like prioritizing the spiritual and sort of seeing the physical as somehow like less good or less important, right? Which I think we're trying to move away from. There's this reality that like they're very closely integrated, right? That like faith is embodied, our bodies are temples of the spirit. So that, I think that's all, seeing the world in that integrated way, I think is generally very important. Give Directly is a secular organization without any sort of particular faith purpose, and so we don't have any sort of particular view or strategy on this. For me, that's been one of the things that I've missed a little bit in working with this team and building it. That I think it's very missional and very kingdom aligned, but we're not talking on a day-to-day basis about how what we're doing is integrated with faith. So I still think that things like this have a big role to play. That they do address like an important part of what Christ cared about and what he ministered to, kind of in his ministry. For me personally, a lot of the motivation for coming to it, the motivation coming for it comes from faith. And I think the evidence, to the extent there is evidence on sort of how material well-being affects spiritual life and relational life and emotional life, is generally pretty positive. But I wouldn't say it's like the tool for both, right? It's possible that we'll find something that is like amazing at both. It's more likely, I think, that there's going to be a mix of things and different ways of engaging with people that address both of those things. I don't think this is going to be detrimental to it, but I wouldn't say like, we don't need churches and relationships and things like that as well. So, yeah.
Yes, we had one question there.
Yes, hello Paul, thank you. I didn't know that you were San Diego too. I live in San Diego, so
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
And
What organization are you here from?
Plans with Purpose.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So I've got to hang out with Scott for a
yeah.
bit, and it's awesome you guys are here. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think that, I know very little, I'm very operations, and I spend a lot of time in the field.
Yeah.
But do you think that when you talk about give directly, when you say cash transfer, is there any implicit behavioral or intervention training that you do with the people that interact with the community that carry much more of a function than you're just saying with the term give directly?
Yeah.
Because I think that every interaction with other community, even the fact of explaining the program, that sets the tone for everything. So is there something implicit that you know or that you don't know about that interaction that you think is also part of the equation of what you're saying?
Yeah, thanks. That's a wonderful question. And so that's exactly right. And especially actually because what we're doing is so atypical and so strange to people in some sense. It's like in a publisher's clearinghouse moment with somebody showing you your door. People often have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of different ways they could interpret it or think about it. So at a very basic level, there's making sure that we're respectful of kind of the community and the way decisions are made, that we're going through the right steps, talking to local leadership about what we're doing and making sure people are on board. And then when we're talking to a community, explaining how things are going to work in a way that's very transparent so they understand who's getting how much money and why that is being done in that way. The messaging to people about like what they're expected to do with it turns out to be, a lot of people are very surprised that the answer is like whatever you think would be best for you and your family. And so actually making sure that that really gets through and that people have heard that, they don't think there's some particular expectation or something they're meant to do, that has actually been one of the trickier things. One of the things that I think we don't know enough about yet is, like, are there ways of doing this that help people to be more reflective and to make decisions that ultimately they're happier with? Like, you know, the evidence is all generally very good, but could it be even better? So for example, we've done some little experiments where we've said, you know, when would you like to get the money? And so the obvious answer would be as soon as possible, and a lot of people say that. But there are some people who say, like, I'd actually like it to come a few months later. Some of that is because, like, I'm busy right now with the agricultural season, or like culturally that's the best time to build a house and that's what I want to do. Some of it is people who say it'd just be good to have a little bit of time to plan and to reflect and talk to people. And so I think that's like a dimension around this where, you know, while preserving this flexibility, right, that's saying like this is not for any particular thing, we can also help it, you know, people find ways to make it work better for them. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sarah?
Thank you. Super interesting. I'd just be keen to hear your thoughts on, like, what do you think the implication of all the learning around cash programming is for Christian development organisations?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I come from a humanitarian background. Like, multi-purpose cash is sort of what we do. It's what everyone's moving towards. It's totally shifting the architecture of how aid is delivered.
Yeah.
But I think, like, I'm really interested to see, like, oh well, how does that translate? Because it's so, like, it's so different to what we do as Christian development organisations.
Yeah.
Should we start giving out cash? Like, that has huge implications for like relational equity and
Yeah.
transfer of that.
Yeah.
And also the narratives around like the impact of giving on the giver.
Yeah.
And like that's a real change, isn't it? To say, oh, I've been sponsoring a child, now I'm just going to give cash. Like, what does that mean for me as a giver? And just be interested to hear your thoughts on
Yeah.
kind of what do you see as the kind of learning to the Christian development organisation space?
Yeah, yeah. I have some thoughts, but could you make it like really concrete? Like, what's an example of something you're doing now, but that you might do, you know, cash transfers instead of, and like, what would that change look like?
So I work for IDA Research, I'm on the research side, but for an organisation that's delivering a program which is a health intervention with a discipleship program connected, for example.
Right.
If from a value for money perspective, it would be much better for them to deliver cash and do something very low cost around training church planters. Is that the learning that's something sort of a direction that organisations should be considering going?
Yeah.
Rather than a sort of more expensive intervention.
So maybe like if you're doing a narrowly targeted health thing, we'd be delivering a health intervention and saying like, can we have a conversation about, you know, how to think about your body from a biblical perspective and your body. Whereas this might be, we're going to give you money and have a conversation about stewardship and like how the Bible thinks about shepherding of resources. And like that could be really interesting, right? I don't know. I guess that's the thing that comes to mind for you there. In terms of the impact of giving on the giver, this is something I've reflected a lot on, because I think that both in philanthropic work and in other areas of my life, I become more and more aware of my sort of instinctive desire to exercise control. Just how deeply ingrained that is in me. You know, like in my family, like I come home and the house is cluttered and it's not the way I like it to be, and I feel out of control and unhappy about that, right? So, or you know, in my work and my advising and mentorship relationships, right, the sort of desire to fix things that aren't going right, as opposed to letting people have some rope and run with it and learn from that experience. So there have just been a whole bunch of fronts for me where I think I've had to confront that, to recognize how strong is my desire to control the environment around me and the impact that has on other people. And I think that this, you know, as a way of giving can be a really powerful tool for self-reflection on that front, right? That perhaps if you find this idea jarring, if there's something about it that feels uncomfortable, that's a really good discomfort to sit with for a bit, right? Which may or may not lead you to ultimately give this way, but I think that it's a good thing to reflect on.
Thank you. Any more questions? Today?
I think we've been mostly focusing on this for the developing world, but is there ways in which this idea translates into the developed world? And I think by extension of that, some of the things that you've mentioned kind of like sound similar to maybe some political controversies on the news about like giving tickets to migrants to go to different cities within the US. And I guess ways in which
like the no lean season thing sounds a bit like that. That's what you're thinking.
Yeah, a little bit. So I guess I'm wondering, is that, if you know enough about that program within the US, is that fundamentally different? And are there examples of this program working within the developed context?
Yeah, I think that is like very different fundamentally. That's that's kind of about allocation of people across space, and it is like definitely very much about like host community receptivity to immigrants and to refugees and things like that. So which are like a hugely important set of issues, but I don't think that sort of like first order connections to the stuff that I've talked about here. You know, just in terms of general acceptance of, you know, this kind of like relatively no strings attached form of support, there's been, you know, periods in U.S. history where there's been a move away from that, like welfare reform in the 1990s. There was a like strong sense that like, you know, there hadn't been enough conditions, enough strings attached, and so, you know, even a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, was like under enough pressure that he signed pretty sweeping changes, right, to the kind of the way the U.S. safety net package system worked. In recent years, it does seem like it's been moving towards more cash-based, you know, sort of child support grants and some of the payments made during the pandemic, and there's been more acceptance of that. So, you know, maybe there's an Overton window there happening right now. But I think that the same sort of basic concerns are still there, right? That sort of there's this deep, you know, we were talking a bit right at breakfast about. I think that like there's good evidence that everybody is somewhat skeptical of everybody else's ability to make good decisions. Right? You see this in evidence on sort of like patients, right? So if you get people into a lab and say like, how patient do you want to be, and how patient do you think other people should be, right? People generally think other people should be more patient and save more, right? Or in the experiments that we were talking about, people generally worry that other people are going to spend too much of their money on alcohol and bad things. So I think there's this like very deep-seated thing in human nature that is always going to be resistant to that.
Thank you. Yeah, one last question, Joy.
I just am curious, like, how do you guys talk about, obviously cash transfers, you're not advocating that it is the perfect intervention,
Yeah.
but like, the idea of like economies of scale, years and years ago I worked with an organization, we worked in very remote rural villages and helped people build trains, right? Which of course has all its own problems, but like, what we were able to do as an organization, we were able to afford things like an entire dump truck of sand, to be able to, you know, pool our resources to get all their supplies up there, whereas like an individual family, unless there was a strong leader, they wouldn't be able to do those things. They wouldn't be able to buy it, even if they wanted to, they thought that was the best thing to do with their, they wouldn't be able to do that. How do you kind of talk about those kind of things, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's like actually a great topic with sort of microeconomies of scale, kind of like at the, you know, village level. So yeah, those are definitely there. Like we've seen some examples of people in communities that have come together to build a road, or sort of like build a row of townhouses where there's some sharing of some of those fixed costs, things like that. So things like that can happen. It's possible that you could structure things that, you know, sort of like what I mentioned earlier, if there's some community decision making about what to do with money, that are sort of intermediate, right, where there is like a real delegation of power, but at the same time, you know, there's scope for doing things that have that kind of public good or fixed cost aspect to them. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, you know, I mentioned briefly that part of the reason you seem to see these big aggregate effects is because I think there are a lot of these like hidden economies of scale in like rural, low density areas where people just could be doing more if their community was wealthier. Right? It's like a very simple point. Like part of what makes it hard for a business to thrive in that setting is there's just not that much purchasing power in the area. So I think there are also some of those sort of hidden indivisibilities that are actually pretty powerful. So yeah, I think I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, one last question, because I think we have time. Anyone? Yes?
Sorry.
No?
Yeah.
Very
Have you
good.
seen any within your metrics to evaluate impact?
Yeah.
Do you have any environmental metrics? I
Yeah.
remember working with Enverada in the Chocó in Colombia, and
Yeah.
talking with them and them saying, all I want to do is to get some money to be able to buy I call it a chainsaw.
Right.
Right. So I'm just curious about it.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot. Most of the stuff we've done has focused on, you know, either sort of pretty standard economic outcomes, kind of household level stuff, or sort of psycho-social, emotional outcomes, you know, measures of well-being, depression, relational health, things like that. And I'm having exactly this thought that, like, for cash transfers, also for a lot of other things, it would be really helpful to get a sense of the environmental consequences. There are some things that are indicative. You know, you can see like how much land people are farming and thinking about whether some of that might have been reclaimed from forest land or things like that. There's an exercise that I'm trying to set up now, which I think would be very interesting, which is try to figure out if I transfer $1 from like a typical American donor to a typical recipient in one of these programs, like what are the carbon consequences of that? That seems actually to me like a really first order question for thinking about this intersection of global development and climate, and so I don't think we know that, but I think that actually it's possible to answer that, so we're working on that one. So I really like that question.
Thank you. So thank you once again.
Yeah.
And another talk starts here 10:15 while starting.